Hi everyone. I wanted to just do a quick walkthrough of some of the ways that you can use the Department of Education in Massachusetts School and District Profiles website. There's a lot of really great ways that we can use this resource to get some really meaningful information about equity. So I wanted to share that with you right now. So the first thing you do is you go to the website. It's profiles.doe.mass.edu. So once you're there, there's the fastest and best way that I find to get to the district I want to go to is type it in up here. So I'm going to just look at a district in Eastern Mass. Let's look at Malden. So Malden's an interesting district. It is really diverse and has like a pretty strong range of achievement, and they've done a lot to really shift their schools. So I think it's a great one to just use as a demographic test case because we have so much to look at there. So I typed in Malden, I chose it from the upper little menu, and now I get to this page. So it is the general landing page, and here we've got the sort of two main places that we're going to be looking at menus. There's this side that will let us click through some information within whatever our upper tab is. So the tab I want us to start at is the Students tab. It's where we're going to be spending most of our time. And what I want to get us today is some basic information about where we can find the data that we might be interested in when we're looking at questions of equity in our schools, and a few different ways we can think about it. How we can sort of take those numbers and make them somehow meaningful. So the first thing when we click on students is we get to this enrollment data section. Here we can look at the percentage of the district, and we can look at the percentage of the state. So this helps us see when we're looking at this district, how does this match up to the bigger trends in Massachusetts? So we have, as we just saw at the top, the general enrollment by race, the general enrollment by gender, and now we have just what are the enrollments by grade, and then what does the kindergarten enrollment look like? So this does not take percentages. This percent is just looking at what percent are in half-day versus full-day kindergartens. Malden, like most districts in Massachusetts, has all students in full-day kindergarten. And then here we've got a similar setup of pre-kindergarten enrollment, and it does look at the percentage of students enrolled. So we're going to have a much higher proportion of students with disabilities because that's a lot of who qualifies automatically for public school kindergarten. And then we can also look here at sort of what the breakdowns are, again, by gender, by demographic subgroup, and by a few other subgroups we're going to be talking about soon. So once we are here on this enrollment data, I think one meaningful thing to look at is you'll see over here, it says Malden, and then it says 2020. There's a little arrow next to here, and we can click back to previous years. So if I wanted to look at how the proportion of white people in Malden public schools had changed, I would want to either note or memorize this number. And then I like to look back over 15 years. We've got a lot of years of back data here. So say it was 27.9% white students in 2020. And I'll go back 5 years. So 19, 18, 17, 16, 2015, we were at 31.8% white students. Slightly higher than currently. Also, I just happened to remember that the proportion of black students in 2020 was 18.2, and this percentage is also slightly higher. So we're going to keep going back. Go back another 5 years. 2010, 35.6% white students, 19.7% black students. So the rate of African American students in Malden Public Schools is staying pretty consistent, as is the rate in the state, but the rate of white students has gone down over the last 10 years. Let's go back another 5 years, and now we're at 2005. And so here it was over half of the district was white. You'll notice that there's fewer demographic subcategories. The ways that they've recorded have shifted somewhat over time. but I think that this can be a really interesting way to get some meaning out of the data. So on this little side menu that I had mentioned, I'm going to go to selected populations. That's the 6th category down. And this has another set of categories. So what we have here is students whose first language isn't English. We have English learners. So you'll notice that that proportion is much lower than first language not English. There's really specific criteria for falling under the English learner category that's based on duration of time and testing and a few other categories. We've got students with disabilities. We've got economically disadvantaged students. That definition as we move backwards has changed several times, but is often linked, at least partially, to students receiving free and reduced lunch. And then we have in the middle here high needs. So that is a non-duplicated count of the selected populations. So if a student has disabilities and is economically disadvantaged, they're not going to be counted twice. So what we see is that 67%, so just over 2/3 of students in Malden Public Schools are English learners, students with disabilities, or economically disadvantaged. So that's a fact for us moving forward. And we could, again, I'm just going to move one set of 5 years back on this. So here in 2014, 60.4% of students were high needs. And I just want to look quickly. So the state, 42.2. So that's higher than the state in general. But I forgot to look at the state in 2020. So now it's 48.7. So Malden's increase and the state's increase have been really similar around high needs populations. One of the reasons I'd like to go back and look at this is because when we look at teachers, we have a lot of teachers who have been in our schools for 15 years. And I think it's really valuable for us to just think, do these schools look the same? Are they the same schools as they were 15 years ago? And by supporting the students that you were supporting 15 years ago, are you still able to support the current population of students? Or is there a bit of a chasm between sort of how people see the school to be and how the school actually is? So there's a lot of things I find fascinating over here. I'm just going to click us to student discipline. It's one of my favorite categories. Massachusetts makes all of this publicly available. A lot of states don't. And a piece of it is because it can look hard when you start really looking at these data displays. You can really get a sense of where the gaps are for students, and states that choose to not make that public may not really want people to be looking at the gap. So I'm really grateful to Massachusetts for making this public because, okay, I can see right here that 3.3% of students in Malden Public Schools have been in school suspended and 3.9% have been out of school suspended. Does that mean that 7.2% of students were suspended? No, because some people can be in both categories. If we want to get the full number, we can divide 7,000, or you can divide 423 by 7,000. So I'm going to say it's somewhere right around 5.5% is just my quick brain math. So I think it's valuable for us to look what groups have lower percentages than that and which groups have higher. So that's an equity issue. Who is getting more of a benefit of the doubt and who is not? So our numbers that are under English learners are less than 3.3%. Girls are less than 3.3%. Asian students and white students. So, and then which groups are markedly higher? Students with disabilities are about 2/3 higher. Male students are about 1/3 higher. Black students are about 50% higher rates. Multiracial students are about 54% higher. And then there's a few that are slightly higher: economically disadvantaged students, high need students as a whole, and Latinx students. And then we look at out of school suspensions. And here I just want to look at what the highest rates are. Economically disadvantaged students, which is interesting. That's a much bigger gap than we had in in-school suspension. I've never looked at Malden data before. This is all new to me as I'm going. Out of school suspensions for students with disabilities are almost 2.5 times the rate, 2.25 times the rate for students without disabilities. Male students, again, significantly higher. Black students are about 55% higher, again, and multiracial students also significantly higher. So these categories over here are mostly going to be 0.0. There's a couple that are 0.1. So we've got an English learner, 0.1, economically disadvantaged students, high needs student, male student, Black student, and white student. So we've got a couple of small numbers, but most of these will be zeros in most cases. So I really focus over on these categories. Another quick way to do it is you can take this category, students disciplined, divided by students, and just create one column that will give you information if you want to transfer this into Excel. You may not be that nerdy, that's my preference, but I got student discipline days missed here. And I think that this is really valuable because we want to think about time on learning for students, right? It really matters who is able to access education and who is missing days due to school-based discipline. And so when we look here, all students, let's look at this 4 to 7 day category because that's when it gets it's really when it drops off, right? One day, 2 to 3 days, those are pretty high numbers. And then we get down under 1% here. So for students with disabilities, we are over 2%. For Black students, we're at 1.5%. For multiracial students, we're at also over 2%. So, and for white students, we're below the average there. For Asian students, we're below the average. So I think it's really interesting to really start to look through this. Just a couple more I want to show you that could be valuable. Grade 9 course passing. You can this is a pretty quick report. You can also pull down, look at specific subjects. Are there any differences in math? View the report. It's just a quick thing that you can really look around at to see if there are real trends that you want to notice. I'm noticing here that the lowest rates of course passing for math are for multiracial students, who we saw were really high in the student discipline days missed, and students with disabilities, who we saw were also really high in student discipline days missed. And for male students, theirs are higher than the other rates, but also connecting with those student discipline days missed. You can look at advanced course completion. You can look at attendance up here under student attendance. What's the average number of absences? How do those play out? There's any of this information can give you valuable info on equity, and I think it gets really meaningful when you start trying to find connections, not necessarily causation, but some connections between the data. There's this one I wanted to show you quickly. It looks different. It says SPED. So this can help you look at a number of indicators that are used for state accountability. And there's an annual performance report available. So to the next section, which is going to be quicker, I wanted to look at teachers. So here we've got some teacher data about generally what % of teachers are licensed in each school. So you'll see here, sometimes there's some gaps. So there's no low poverty schools in Malden, so there's nothing to compare. Percentage of teachers licensed in high poverty schools is 100%, which is significantly higher than the state average. Percent of teachers without provisional license is 87%, which is quite close to the state average. I think that this is really interesting and confusing to me. So we know that all the schools in Malden, there aren't any low poverty schools. So I guess maybe I'm just interested in how percent of teachers without provisional license is 93.4, and then in high poverty schools it's 87. So I think that that's interesting. So then you can pull down this staffing data by race, ethnicity, gender, and think about how this matches up with our general information. So we know that just under 20% of students in Malden are Black, and here we have about 4% of educators are Black, of staff, not necessarily just educators. And we have, I think, pretty similar populations of Asian and Latinx students, and about 3% each, I think, is what those numbers might look like. Whereas white students, who we know, what do we say, are like 28% of the district, look like they are about 90% of educators. So I think that this is just, again, an interesting thing to look at. We know that multiracial students have those high rates of discipline and low rates of passing, but we notice there's also a really low rate of teachers who are mixed race. And we can also look at staffing retention rates. This, I think, is especially interesting if you're comparing district to district. So if I wanted to look at what things look like in Malden versus Lexington, I might want to check out here, okay, 89% of teachers are retained, but only 25% of their principals are retained for between these 2 years. Is that normal for them? Let's pull back. Previous year, 100% of principals were retained. 71.4, 100. So that seems like a really off year. So you really want to make sure that you're not just taking a quick snapshot and making strong stories about it. And again, just this last piece that can be useful if you're comparing districts is this educator evaluation performance rating. So what % of teachers are in each of these categories? And so exemplary and proficient, exemplary is usually not going to have that many educators in it. Proficient is probably going to be the largest category in all of these. So you're going to want to really just think about it if you're comparing the two. So I want to quickly move to assessment. So this gives us an incredible amount of information about the MCAS, and we can use that not because the MCAS is the end all and be all, but it can tell us about elements of who is able to effectively access this particular form of testing that is used for a lot of purposes for students and schools. So on the side menu, I'm going to click on MCAS results by subgroup. And yeah, here we go. So this is a lot of data. Like, these are just data. So I want to give you a few suggestions of how you might want to look at this. I always recommend transferring things into an Excel spreadsheet if that's helpful for you, or a Google Sheet or whatever, some form of spreadsheet. But I think that your best way to look at MCAS by subgroup is to look in one of these 3 ways: comparing across age, comparing across content, or comparing across year. So looking at a couple of different accountability subgroups, which is what this top section are called: students with disabilities, English learners and former English learners, economically disadvantaged, high needs, Black, Native American, Asian, Latinx, multiracial, or white. So great, I'm looking at this, and say I want to think about how students of different races are doing on the MCAS, or how students with disabilities are doing in comparison to students without disabilities, which are down here under this other subgroups. So I might want to think, okay, 3rd grade MCAS, how are they doing in ELA? Let's look at high needs. Let's look at economically disadvantaged students and non-economically disadvantaged students. Those are groups of pretty similar size, 258 and 213. So, and they both have very high participation rates. Malden has very high MCAS participation rates. So we have here in the district, 37 students are exceeding or meeting expectations, and we have, 37% of students, and we have 62% of students are not. So what about non-economically disadvantaged? When we're looking at non-economically disadvantaged students, 63% are exceeding or meeting, and 37% are not. So that's our information for ELA. And now we can move down to math in the same grade level, third grade. So here we've got 35% exceeding or meeting versus 49%. So it looks like in general students are across economic levels are more successful in ELA than in math in the third grade level, but that there is a significant gap on each. Another way to look is to look at across ages. So I'm going to say, what's our number here? 37% are exceeding or meeting versus 63. So 37 to 63. And I'm going to write this down because I love numbers, but I cannot memorize that much. So this is my first set. And now I'm going to look at the fifth grade MCAS, because I don't think there's any reason to bother to look at the fourth grade. Those are very close together, but you could disagree perfectly well. So, okay, these numbers are pretty close. So 35% of economically disadvantaged students in math are exceeding or meeting, and non-economically disadvantaged students were at 42%. Okay, oops, sorry, I was looking at ELA. Let's try this again. So we've got 43% in ELA and 55% of non-economically disadvantaged students. So now let's jump to 8th grade. So here we have 45% of economically disadvantaged students are meeting or exceeding, and 57% of non-economically disadvantaged students are. And so then we look up to 10th grade, and we have 42% and 55%. So in this case, there is not a gap that is increasing across time. We in some districts will see students who things are very close together when they're younger, and then that gap, that chasm just grows, or vice versa. So I think that this is helpful information to really be looking at what the district is doing, supporting students across age. And then we could also look across year. Similar strategy, just look at third grade MCAS, go click that little arrow up at the top again, and go back across a few years. The last area I want to show you is trends. So click at this trends dart at the top. So when we are looking here, we have Malden listed up at the top. It finds us a series of districts that it thinks are similar, most similar in terms of grade span, total enrollment, and special population. So they're trying to balance a bunch of pieces of information here. And so they're looking for special populations, economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, and English learner percentages. So we got Malden. They give us some suggestions of comparable districts. I am going to choose Everett because that is pretty close in terms of numbers, right? So we've got like 6,481, so it's only about 600 more students. And some of their numbers are higher, some are lower, so I think it'll be an interesting one. So I click here on this little drop-down menu, and I'm going to choose Everett. And then I'll click that little arrow to go. That is not what I meant to happen. All right, let's click here. Okay, so that's the other way to do it. If you're choosing one of the districts they've offered you, you can just click on their name in that section. So I can look at their enrollment levels by number and by percent. So obviously their percent of enrollment is going to be 100%. We've got our stability rate, how many students are enrolled all year. And we can see with both Malden and Everett, those rates are lower than that light gray, hard to see one for the whole state. Their percentage of kindergarten students enrolled in full day kindergarten is both at 100 because they only have full day kindergarten. The states, as you can see, is trending up across years as more and more states, more and more districts are only offering full day. School age residents enrolled in public school. So we've got all that information. We can also check out different subgroups. So let's say I want to look at English learners. I'll click that there and I'll click the little go arrow. So we can see the enrollment, the stability rate, all of that information is here again. So this shows us the percent of English learners in the school. Malden, pretty constant, trending down slightly. Everett trending up somewhat. We can check out their next generation MCAS scores. Also here we can look at all students, subgroups, or we can pull out specific ones. So here we're looking at the third grade MCAS and how it has gone across time. So got some pretty low rates for meeting and exceeding expectations in both districts. Everett's, though, really shot up in 2019. The state is also pretty low, and this is helpful to see, right? Like, this whole state only, what, 22% of, it got all the way up to 26% of students are meeting or exceeding third grade ELA that are English learners. So these numbers aren't great, but they're pretty on trend with what the state looks like. So these are our average scaled scores. There's a lot to look around at here. Student support. Okay, what does attendance look like in both of these districts? What's your percent of students that are out of school suspended? Look, Everett's is going down, Malden's is going up. So there's a lot to play around with in this DART section. These are the analysis and review tools for each district. And you can pull out some more information if you really want to play in your own spreadsheet, but I think you can get a lot just out of this. So I really encourage you to look through this and to really be using your sort of equity brain to be thinking about what we can do with this information. Is there anything you then want to encourage your district, a district you work in, a district your children are in school in, a district where you live, anything you want to encourage them to do to create a more equitable culture and climate based on what you're able to find here? Thank you so much, and I hope this was helpful.